Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with a former player from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, Ange Armato. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was founded by Philip K. Wrigley. The league existed from 1943 to 1954 and was the first women's professional sports league in the United States. While it held strict standards for how women had to dress and act, it was seen as radical at the time. Over 600 women played in the league, which consisted of 10 teams located all around the Midwest at its peak. In 1948, league attendance climbed to over 900,000 spectators. The most successful team, the Rockford Peaches, won a league-best 4 championships, including 3 straight from 1948 through 1950. Scouted from amateur softball games across the country, over 200 women were invited to the initial tryout, and about 60 were selected for the league roster. Like the male major league, the girls' league was also informally segregated. Thus, no African Americans were recruited or hired. Women were selected for their skilled play, but the player also needed to fit what was seen by marketers as a wholesome, feminine ideal. Our guest on today's episode, Ange Armato, was born and raised in Rockford, Illinois. Ange spent 4 years practicing with the Rockford Peaches before being officially invited to spring training with the team heading into the 1949 season. Why did the Peaches wait so long before making that invitation to Ange? Because she was 19 years old in 1949, meaning she had been practicing with the team since she was only 15. She shagged fly balls, helped with base running and fielding drills, and was eventually promoted to throwing batting practice for the league's best team. Ange was offered and signed a contract after that 1949 spring training, and she was set to play infield and wear number 4 for the Peaches that season. Unfortunately, later that spring as a senior at West High School in Rockford, Ange slid in a sliding pit down the left field foul line at Bayer Stadium, where the Peaches played their home games, and broke her foot. Her injury meant she didn't play a single game for the Peaches in 1949. A year which saw the team finish with the best record in the regular season and win the league championship for the second straight year. It was the first time a team had ever repeated as champions in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, and in 1950, Rockford would make it 3 straight. Ange's injury took her down a different career path for a couple years, instead of playing for the Peaches or any other team in the league. However, by 1953, Ange was fully recovered from her injury and, as a 23-year-old, finally achieved her dreams of playing in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Ange signed with the Kalamazoo Lassies after their manager saw her play softball in the Chicagoland area. Ange played second base, shortstop, and right field, and wore number 12 for Kalamazoo in 1953, as the team went 56-50 during the regular season and made it to the playoffs. They beat the Fort Wayne Daisies in the first round of the playoffs, but lost to the Grand Rapids Chicks in the championship. I was lucky enough to be introduced to Ange through Dave Pierce, who's a Rockford Peaches collector. Dave and I met through our mutual friend and former guest on the podcast, Greg Kreinler, who Dave had previously commissioned to paint some peaches. The three of us spent time chatting at the 2023 National Sports Collectors Convention in Chicago, which just so happened to be the week before the U.S. Women's National Baseball team was scheduled to play an exhibition game at Bayer Stadium in Rockford. While I had been to the site before, I had never seen a game there, so I made the trip to check it off my bucket list. Dave and I caught up again that day. He asked if I would be interested in seeing his Peaches collection and potentially interviewing a former player he was friends with. I barely let him finish the question before enthusiastically agreeing, and about a week later, Ange and I were sitting down together recording this interview. So thanks, Dave, for sharing your collection with me and setting all this up. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Ange tells us what it was really like to be a player in the league made famous by Gina Davis, Tom Hanks, Madonna, and Rosie O'Donnell in Penny Marshall's 1992 film A League of Their Own. We find out what the tryout and filming process was like for the final scene in that movie, where a field full of genuine former players from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League played a pickup game at Doubleday Field in Cooperstown, New York, from someone who actually went through it and appeared in the film. We learn how the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League went through many different sets of rules, field dimensions, and equipment sizes and regulations throughout its history, starting out more closely resembling softball before slowly evolving into authentic baseball. And we hear the names and accolades of some of the league's best players, many of whom Ange either played with or against. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth. So I provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Ange and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Ange Armato episode listed first on the main page under latest episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our previous episodes, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of the 3 seasons to date and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. But now, here's my interview with former All-American Girls Professional Baseball League player, Ange Armato. You were born October 27th, 1929 in Rockford, Illinois. You were the 7th of 8 children. What was it like to grow up with that many kids in the house?
Terrible. My mom, I think she spoiled me terribly because my sister, who was the 4th child, died at 12 years old. And I was born just right after that. So I think she named me after her. So it was a matter of her taking care of me.
Yeah.
And she did, really.
Well, your father objected to you playing any sports, but your mother and your sister saw your art ability and they were trying to focus your talents in that direction. Your parents came up with enough money to send you to art school in Rockford. Did you actually love art or were you just good at it?
I at first said I wanted to play baseball or softball and then be an artist later on. But as it was, I got to be an artist sooner than I thought it was.
Right, yeah. When your father wasn't home, you would run to the school playground behind your house to play basketball, softball, and race with the boys your age, and you'd win a lot of the time. Was there ever any issue with you being a girl and playing sports with boys growing up?
No, we didn't have any problems at the school. It was so close to us because it was in the backyard. And I'd go there and play with the guys all the time. But there were 2 other girls that would come with me, so I didn't feel like I was out of place. But we enjoyed it. We played wraparound baseball.
Okay.
That you'd take one base and then switch.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the kind of baseball we played.
Yeah. You got to improvise when you don't have 18 people to field 2 different teams of 9 players each. So
that's all we had.
Yeah.
We had about 10 boys and the 3 girls. We would take turns.
Yeah, that's a good number.
So we played that way.
You saw your first Rockford Peaches game at Bayer Stadium in 1943 when you were 13 years old. You sat in the grandstand behind third base, and you were hooked. What do you remember about going to Bayer Stadium, and what was it like to watch women playing professional baseball in your hometown?
Actually, it was 45
when
I saw the first game.
Because I saw a newspaper article in your scrapbook that wrote that you were 13.
43?
Yeah.
As far as I know, it was 45 because I got the program. And I sold it to this guy back here.
I saw it.
So actually, I was just surprised that the girls were playing baseball. They weren't really playing baseball, they were playing softball.
Right.
And I saw Carolyn Morris and all the other girls. I was just so impressed with them that I said to myself, that's what I want to be.
Yeah.
So I started out the next day. I went to the stadium and asked Bill if I can shag their balls.
Bill Allington, the manager.
Yes.
Yeah.
I got to do that. And I did that for the whole year. So I asked him, I said, can I come back next year? He says, yeah. So I did that for 3 years. And during that time, he told me, I'd like you to go to school for baseball to learn some of the techniques. And so I, as a child at that time, got to go on the bus by myself to Chicago. And I played like in the movie.
Yeah.
We had a school there that we went to. They taught us everything about baseball.
You mentioned that early on, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was basically playing softball. Starting in 1943, when the league began, they were using a 12-inch ball. There were 65 feet between bases, and the pitching distance was only 40 feet, but they were pitching underhand. When you were 14, your parents finally gave you their approval, and you started playing amateur softball. When it came to cleats and gloves and bats and things like that, was there equipment available that was made specifically for women, or did you just have to buy men's equipment and just make it work?
I had to buy my glove, and I don't recall buying any baseball bats.
When you went to go see the Rockford Peaches games, or just being around Rockford in general, were the players like celebrities among the people of Rockford? Like, do you remember being in awe of them and asking for autographs and things like that?
Well, the thing was, I remember is that most of the girls lived at families that had rooms for them. And that's how they lived. They would stay with these people. And I didn't know too many of the girls at the time when they were playing softball, that they were in the houses like that.
Yeah.
But I never saw them signing autographs for anybody.
Interesting.
I asked for autographs a lot of times, but I didn't see too many people asking them.
Do you remember having a favorite player on those early teams?
Well, Snooky Harold was my favorite.
Yeah.
The shortstop.
Right.
And I liked her. And I tried to play like her.
Dorothy Snooky Harrell eventually became Snooky Doyle when she got married. A smooth fielding shortstop who played with the Peaches from 1944 to 1952. She was a 5-time All-Star who collected 667 hits and stole 229 bases in her career. After 8 seasons in the league, Snooky moved on to softball, playing with teams in Phoenix, Portland, and Los Angeles. And at the end of her softball career, she even served as manager of the champion Orange Lionettes. She was a fan favorite in Rockford. Not just your favorite, but
I know.
Lots of people liked her.
They adored her. The people there were just in love with the Peaches. There was nothing else but them as far as they were concerned. And you can tell that now.
Yeah.
Because the people that even remember them playing, they're in awe of them.
Right. In 1944-45, the war is going on at this point. Was that something that you thought about and talked about every day, or did it not really feel super dangerous because you guys were in Rockford, Illinois?
Never thought about it.
Yeah,
Never gave it a thought. I was too young to even think about war and so forth. In fact, one day when I went to the movies, I heard that the war broke out. I ran home and cried because I didn't know what was happening.
Right.
I thought they were coming over here. But as it was, I got over that quickly.
In 1945, you were invited to play with a traveling league out of DeKalb, Illinois, but you were only 15, so your coach had to pay an older player to come to Rockford and drive you to all the games so you could play shortstop. Did the other players on your team treat you well, being that you were the youngest and the smallest on the team?
Yeah, they were great. The DeKalb team was one of my favorites. I was sorry I had to leave them after that one year, but they were stupendous, really. They treated me like I was from there.
Yeah.
Really.
So 1945, that's the season we're talking about. You were 15 years old. You also practiced with the Rockford Peaches that year. Were you able to practice with them because you were local and they were just looking for bodies since the team rosters only had 15 people on them? Or were you like actively invited because they knew who you were specifically from your softball days? Like, how did that come about that you got to play with them?
Actually, it was just me that went to the stadium, and I asked them to shag balls for them. Well, it got to the point where the second and third year, I got to pitch to them.
Right.
And that was something I really loved doing. And the manager kept saying to me, "You're pretty good at that." So he would let me pitch to them all the time. I even had pictures of it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So the Peaches won the regular season league title in 1945 and then also went on to beat the Fort Wayne Daisies in the playoffs to win the league championship that year, which really began their string of dominance in the league. How exciting was it for you to watch this team, which was from your hometown, win a championship, especially knowing that you played a small part in that?
I was really excited about it because I went to all the games at night. I'd walk there and run, walk and run about a mile from my home. And my mom let me go. And I just enjoyed every minute of it.
Do Do you remember what the games cost? Like how much a ticket cost to get in?
Oh, not very much. It was like a quarter.
Yeah.
I don't remember it to be any more than that.
And were they making you pay specifically, or since you were kind of a part of the team, did you get in for free?
I don't even remember what I did at that time. I just know that I went to every game.
Yeah.
And I don't recall ever paying for it.
That's a nice deal.
So I might have gotten in free.
That'd be nice.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the games were at night. Were they playing under lights, or were they playing in the evening just before the sun went down?
They were playing at night, and they did have lights out there. And the stands were massive on one side. They were all stone steps going up. And then the other side had the bleachers, but they were filled every night. And I was just shocked that a girls' team could do that.
Yeah. So the next year you played baseball with the Rockford K&K Co-eds.
Yes. That was a team that I had designed a uniform for.
Yeah.
Because for some reason or other, we were always playing in slacks and shorts and whatever. And I said, why don't I design us something that we can play in?
And you're only 15 years old at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. And it was just shocking that I came up with the idea that it would be black and white.
Yeah.
I really thought it was fantastic that the girls loved them.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about that team and the level of talent and competition in that league compared to the All-American Girls League?
Well, that team was a traveling team. And we'd go to all the cities that were like Kenosha, Chicago, South Chicago. We played one team there that I had a friend for over 50 years after that.
Oh, wow.
Because it was just that enjoyable. You met a lot of people. You met all the players that were playing. It was just great to be part of it all.
So you practiced again that year with the Rockford Peaches, but for 1946, the league distance between the bases increased from 68 feet to 72 feet, and the pitching distance increased from 42 feet to 43 feet, while the size of the ball decreased from 11.5 inches down to 11 inches. Did you kind of start to feel like you were actually part of the team in 1946, or was it clear that, like, no, you're still just there to help?
No, I was just there to help them. I knew that I was too young. I was too small. I weighed only 100 pounds at the time. And then my mom decided she would give me eggnogs every day. And I would have that all the time. And I said, oh, Mom, please. But I hated food. I just hated it because I wanted to go out and play all the time.
Yeah. In 1946, the Peaches lost 1-0 in 16 innings in the final game of the championship series to the Racine Bells. So they were that close to winning back-to-back championships because they had won in 1945. So 1947, at this point, you're actually pitching at batting practice and just practicing in general with the Rockford Peaches. So that's 3 years in a row now that you're basically a part of the team. So the next year, Peaches manager Bill Allington officially invites you to spring training with the team down in Opelika, Florida.
Correct.
So in 1948, the pitching mound is moved back another 7 feet, making the distance 50 feet to home plate. It would also be the first year that pitching in the league would be overhand, and the size of the ball decreased again from 11 inches down to 10 3/8 inches. How big of an adjustment were those changes for you personally and for everyone in general? I mean, you're changing basically from playing softball to now playing baseball.
I didn't have any problems with the change because I enjoyed playing the ball. In that case, I really liked the small ball because you could throw overhand. And I was more talented with that than I was with a softball. I didn't like the size of a softball.
Yeah.
But I played it. I really had a lot of fun doing it. But I enjoyed the smaller one.
Yeah, interesting. Due to your age and size, like you mentioned earlier, Bill Allington thought that you should finish school and put some weight on. So during the 1948 season, you were shortstop for the DeKalb girls team again, and you were also shortstop for the Rockford All-Stars girls team. The Peaches won the league championship again in 1948, once again beating the Fort Wayne Daisies for the title like they'd had in 1945. For the first time in 1948, an attempt was made to institute some form of a minor league system for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. There was a Chicago training school and 2 minor leagues whose aim was to develop talent for the parent clubs. In 1949, 19 girls who went through that program in 1948 were assigned to parent clubs in the All-American League, including 2 to the Rockford Peaches. One was Arlene Houston, who was a pitcher and outfielder, and the other was you. You and Arlene played in DeKalb in 1948, so you had gotten a chance to know each other before you were called up to the Peaches together. Did it help to be able to go through that experience with someone you knew as opposed to coming into training camp alone, or were you not really concerned with that because you had already spent so many years with the Peaches?
Well, when they decided that I would go to spring training in 48, I would go with Gene Sion. And Gene was well known already as a pitcher. And I thought, gosh, I'm going to get to stay with her. So I went and stayed with her, and I stayed at the hotel, and the next day we got on the train. And it took us 2.5 days to get there.
Yeah.
But everybody on the train was so happy to be there. All the rookies were there. And the whole league was invited to the spring training. So we were down there for a whole month. Here I was so young and down there. I just loved it.
Yeah, it sounds like spring break. Just all these young people who share a love of baseball, all just hanging out in Florida playing ball during the day. And you know, what were you guys getting up to at night?
I don't recall too much other than the fact that I would see a lot of bottles sitting out on the floor in, I think it was a naval base before. And I think all the bottles were lined up all along the floor. I never had a drink because I wasn't a drinker at the time. But I enjoyed seeing that because these girls were really having a good time.
Was there a shorthand way that the players referred to the league? Like how players call Major League Baseball MLB or the Bigs or the Show? Was there a quick way that you would all refer to All-American Girls Professional Baseball League? Because even the acronym AAGPBL is still kind of long and clunky. Was there some way that you guys just all talked about it in a quick way?
No. We never really thought about it. It was something that we just knew we loved baseball and we were going to play baseball.
Yeah.
And that's, as far as the league was concerned, we had that little yellow card and it said you were a player. That's all we cared about.
Yeah.
And that's what I cared about, really.
So the league had some more changes in 1949, again moving the distance of the pitching mound back, this time 5 more feet to a total distance of 55 feet, and again decreasing the size of the ball, this time to 10 inches. Did it feel like every year you kind of had to start from scratch, learning how to play a new brand of ball and a new distance on base paths and pitching mounds and everything like that?
I don't think any of the girls realized that it did change because they just took it for granted that they were going to play ball. They knew how to do it, and they didn't seem to make any difference on the size, and I didn't have any problems with it.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
So in 1949, you're now 19 years old. The distance between the bases is 72 feet, and you're invited to spring training with the Rockford Peaches again this year, which this time was held at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. You went into that spring training fully expecting to make the team after having spent the previous 4 seasons regularly practicing with them. So now you're 19, you've grown up physically like Billy Ellington wanted you to. So after spring training, you're offered a contract with the Peaches and you signed it. Do you remember what the terms of that contract were, how long it was for, how much you were going to be paid, things like that?
I don't really remember exactly what was involved. I just knew that I was going to get to play for all the people that I knew in Rockford. And there were so many people in the stands that knew who I was, but I never gave it a thought, really.
What type of player were you? What were your biggest strengths as a player?
I think I was a fielder. I have to boast because I enjoyed it. All that time that I practiced with the Peaches, I was playing ball during the day.
Right.
So I would go out there in the morning and practice with them, and then I'd go into the league. And I was terrific at it. I played the shortstop, and the second baseman was a friend of mine that went to school with me. On the Peaches, that was a different story. But we had so much fun. I think was the best part of my life.
And it's no wonder you were getting so good. I mean, you're playing ball all day, every day with very talented teams and players. So, of course, you're going to get better. And
nobody saw me at home, really.
Where did you generally hit in the batting order on your teams?
Probably second. I was a fast runner.
Were you a good base stealer?
Yeah. I was a good runner, and that's a good position to be in.
Yeah. The uniform in the All-American Girls League was a dress with a flared 3/4 length skirt instead of pants or even shorts like most other women's baseball and softball teams wore, because league managers wanted to emphasize the feminine image of the players. Satin shorts were worn under the skirt, but what would happen when players would slide in those uniforms?
Oh, they would get the strawberries like crazy. I never really had to slide too much because I never got to play that much. Being a rookie, you just didn't play enough baseball.
Yeah.
And I was really wanting to play all the time, really.
Did the fact that when you slide, you get strawberries, did that affect the way that people played? Like, would players slide head first more or decide not to try to stretch a single into a double because they didn't want to have to slide when they got to the next base?
Well, I think it depended on the person. When I would slide, I would always grab some dirt in my hands so I could keep my hands up. Otherwise, I would scratch the heck out of them.
Yeah, interesting. Did each team have 2 sets of uniforms, like one for home games and one for away games, or did every team have their own unique color uniform so they could always wear that one specific color both at home and on the road but never match their opponents?
I don't remember ever wearing another color uniform. I knew that with Kalamazoo it was white, and with the Peaches it was that...
Like a cream color, kind of?
Yeah, it did have some peach in it.
Yeah. So you were going to play infield and wear number 4 for the Peaches in 1949, but as a senior at West High School, you slid into a sliding pit down left field line at Bayer Stadium, and you broke your foot, and that caused you to lose your contract. How devastating was that for you?
That was terrible, because, like I said, I lived almost a mile away from the stadium, and I ran there that day practically all the way. And I got there and I told Bill, I says, my foot is healed and I'm ready to play. And he said, he says, I'm sorry, because we have already had another player fill your spot. And so he says, I don't think you're going to ever be able to play again. I was stunned. I was devastated. I went home and I cried and I cried. And I thought, hey, I have a friend that's living in Chicago, and she plays for the Bloomer Girls. I said, I'm going in there and see how well I can play. So I did that. I asked my mom. My dad would never say anything. But I asked her, and I said, I have to go in for a few days. I'll stay with this gal. She used to play with the Peaches, and she's playing now with the Bloomer Girls. I said, I want to just go see if I can play. So I did, and I played just as good as I ever did. And I came back feeling great.
As good as that must have felt, wasn't that even harder to accept that you weren't able to play with the Peaches?
I was angry, needless to say, but I thought, well, I've got to go on with my life. So if they're telling me I can't play, and I know I can, I might as well give it up and go on and play as an artist.
Yeah.
So what I did was I went back to Rockford. I worked at the company that I wanted to work for, Barbara Coleman.
What were you doing there?
Well, I started out as a file clerk. Then I went to drafting.
Okay.
Then I went to aircraft. Every 6 months I could transfer, and that's what I did. I begged them to take me on as a person that would work there, but they told me that I was too young to work there. And I said, no, I can do that. Yeah. And I did. And I was kind of a pioneer because I was doing all the men's work.
And you're only 19 years old.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you were...
I was trying different types of art because I had no education other than the high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to this friend of mine, I said, let's go in and see this Ruth Spruce Company. They're the ones that make these technical illustrations. I said, I'd like to do that. She said, well, how are you going to do that? She says, you never did it before. I said, I'm going to go and see what they say. So I did get to go. She came with me. She said, I don't believe you. So I went there, and I went into the building, and I saw Ruth Spruce Company. And I went into her office, and there was the Christmas tree hanging from the ceiling. I couldn't believe it. I said, this is a place I got to work for. So she decided to teach me how to do technical illustrating. She didn't know how to do it, but she was going to make me learn how to do it.
Amazing.
And I did.
So the Peaches had the best record in the regular season and won the league championship for the second straight year in 1949, this time beating the South Bend Blue Sox in the finals. It was the first time a team had ever repeated as champions in the league. I'm sure you had mixed emotions watching that 1949 team win that title.
No?
Never
saw it. Never saw a game after that day. He told me I had to leave baseball.
Interesting. So you weren't keeping up at all in the newspapers, or your friends weren't telling you or anything like that?
I went to Chicago directly from there.
Wow.
And I stayed in Chicago for a while. And then my mom passed away. I stayed in Chicago for 3 years after that and worked for Ruth Spruce. And did all the work that Barbara Coleman wanted them to do.
Yeah.
I was doing it in there. So when I came home, I did it for Barbara Coleman.
So the 1950 season ended the same way as the 1949 season, with the Peaches having the best record in the regular season and then winning the championship, making it 3 in a row and 4 in 6 years. The Peaches lost in the 1951 championship to the South Bend Blue Sox, who avenged their loss in 1949, and the 1952 season ended the same way, with the South Bend Blue Sox beating the Peaches in the championship. So the Peaches lost 1-0 in 16 innings in the final game of the 1946 championship series. They were up 2-0 in 1951 before South Bend took the final 3 games to win the best-of-5 series, and lost again in 5 games in 1952 after Gene Fout of the South Bend Blue Sox won 2 games pitching and went 6 for 20 with 2 triples and 3 RBIs in the series at the plate. So that means that from 1945 to 1952, a span of 8 seasons, the Peaches made it to the championship series 7 times, they won 4 of them, and the 3 series that they lost them all in the last possible game, one of them in 16 innings. That is a string of dominance that would never be matched in the league. But think how tired those players were by the end of the 1952 season. Remember, there's only 15 players on each roster. In 1952, the Peaches played 109 games in 110 days, with only 4 days off. Their longest stretch of the season had them playing games on 43 consecutive days, including 4 different road trips. Just an absolutely grueling schedule, especially after making deep playoff runs in nearly every previous season. Did you guys have a training staff? How did you make it through a season like that? And how did you deal with injuries?
Number one, I wasn't playing at the time.
Right, but the teams in the league in general.
The girls, they loved the baseball. They would play every hour of the day.
I love baseball too, but sometimes your body doesn't let you do that.
They did.
Wow.
Because I would see them on the Kalamazoo team afterwards when I played with them. They would play every minute of the day if they had to. Mm-hmm. I knew I would do it.
Yeah.
But I couldn't because they said I was a rookie.
You mentioned that Bayer Stadium had lights, so you didn't have to always play day games in Rockford, which would have added to how tough it was to play in those times if every game was played in the heat of the day. Did most of the stadiums back then have lights, or was Rockford kind of special?
I don't remember exactly what the other stadiums had, but I think we played most of the time at night. Mm-hmm. I don't recall playing during the day.
Interesting. Let's talk about some of the great Rockford Peaches who were part of that dynasty that we just talked about. We already mentioned Snooky Harrell. Let's talk about Dorothy Dottie Kamenchek. She began playing softball at the age of 12, batting and throwing left-handed. She was spotted by a scout from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League and joined the Rockford Peaches as an outfielder when the league began in 1943. She was 17 years old. She soon moved to first base, where she and shortstop Snooky Harrell formed the league's best double-play combination. Kamenchek played 10 seasons in the league, all of them with the Peaches. She's the league's all-time leader in hits and total bases, and she was named an All-Star in all 7 seasons when All-Star teams were named. She won 2 batting titles, hitting .345 in her best season, and in 3,736 at-bats in her career, she only struck out 81 times. She was so good that at one point she was recruited by a men's team from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, but she believed they only wanted her for publicity, so she turned down the offer. She was the batting champion in 1946 and 47. How good was she? What do you remember about Dottie? What sticks out to you?
She was very good. I would say nobody would be able to touch her as far as her talent. She was a fantastic ball player. When Snooky would throw to her, she'd whip it underhand, and Dottie would catch it no matter where it was. And I remember her to be the best, really.
Did you guys have captains on your team? Like, was there somebody who was anointed the leader, or was there just somebody in the clubhouse who took that?
Only as an amateur do I remember anybody being a captain. Mm-hmm. But All-American girls, I don't recall anybody being a captain.
Who would you say was the leader of that team, of the Peaches, when you were a part of it?
I'd say Snooky was.
Interesting.
Because Dottie was fantastic, but Snooky was a leader, and that's where it was.
Yeah. Let's talk about Eleanor Callow. She was born in Winnipeg. She played for the Peoria Red Wings in 1947 and briefly with the Chicago Colleens in 1948 before coming to the Peaches, where she would play the rest of the 1948 season. She stayed with Rockford until the league folded after the 1954 season. Eleanor was more than just the greatest power hitter in league history. On top of being the all-time leader in home runs and triples, Callow was perhaps the league's best all-around position player. A speedy outfielder with a strong throwing arm, Callow ranks in the top 10 in career batting average and was one of only 2 players in league history to post a 20-20 season with 20 home runs and 20 stolen bases. She was an elite 5-tool player before that was a thing that people even considered. She may have also been the best clutch hitter in the league. She's one of only 5 sluggers with at least 400 career RBI, and she was named to an all-star team in 7 of her 8 professional seasons. But she was at her best in the postseason, hitting .322 and setting playoff records for most career RBIs, doubles, and triples. She would have put up even better career numbers had the league not ceased operations shortly after her 27th birthday. How good was Eleanor Callow?
She was another player that really was very good. I only got to see her a short while, but as far as I was concerned, she was one of the best.
Yeah. It seemed like one of the prerequisites to be a part of the Rockford Peaches was to be named Dorothy and go by Dottie. So we already talked about Snooky Harrell, who was Dorothy, and Dorothy Kamenchek. And now let's talk about Dorothy Ferguson, Dottie Ferguson, and then when she got married, Dottie Key. A Canadian softball player, she was also a speed skating champion. She joined the Peaches in 1945 at the age of 23, originally playing second base. Her speed led her to be moved to center field, where she could use her speed and great arm to make plays that most others couldn't. She wasn't a great hitter, but she wasn't afraid to get hit. One season, she was hit by 92 pitches. Once she was on base, her quickness made her an excellent base stealer, something she did 461 times during her 10-year career. What are some of your recollections of Dottie Key?
Dottie was a good friend of mine because she lived in Rockford after the season was over, and when I retired, I would see her in the donut shop, and she would be there, and I played golf with her. I bowled with her. Dottie was a nice person. She stayed here because she loved Rockford, and she was a good player. And she'd get hit all the time. Everybody would say, she's going to get hit again.
Whatever works. Either get a hit or get hit, but get on base. And that's what she did.
She would do anything to get on base.
Yeah. What about Lois Flash Florick? She played for the South Bend Blue Sox and Kenosha Comets from 1943 to 1946, where she split time between third base and outfield. In 1946, the Comets also tried her as a pitcher, where she struggled, so she came over to the Peaches in 1947, and Rockford exclusively used her on the mound, focusing on turning her into a great pitcher. From 1947 until her retirement after the 1950 season, Lois went 77-44 with an ERA of 1.18. She struck out 702 batters in 1,051 innings pitched and was a 2-time All-Star, and she was named the league's pitching champion in 1949. Do you remember watching her kind of come to prominence as a pitcher?
I saw her at practice many times, and she would practice constantly. I always thought she was one of the best pitchers I'd seen.
Part of her career was pitching underhand, and part of it was overhand. How were players learning how to make that adjustment?
Well, I did the same thing
Yeah.
when I was practicing, and it wasn't difficult. I don't know, maybe it was our ability to do strange things because we'd all changed like overnight.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the changes, really.
Do you remember what kind of pitches you were throwing when you learned how to throw overhand? Like, were you throwing curveballs and change-ups?
Oh, yeah.
And
I could throw a curveball.
Yeah.
I was angry when I went to Kalamazoo because he wouldn't let me be a pitcher. I said I could play more if I was a pitcher, but he wouldn't do it.
All right, a couple more Peaches we should probably talk about. Helen Nikki Nicole,
Fox.
eventually when she got married, Helen Fox. She was born in Alberta, Canada, where she became the city's top softball pitcher before her 20th birthday. She once struck out 23 batters in a 1940 playoff game. In 1942, she won the deciding game of the Western Canadian Championship while pitching for the Edmonton Walk-Rights, but was lured south to play in the All-American League. So she played for the Kenosha Comets from 43 to 47 and was named the league's pitching champion in 1943 and 44. She even acted as the team's chaperone in 1945 at the age of 25. Halfway through the 1947 season, she was traded to the Peaches, where she played until she retired after the 1952 season. She had speed and control and was one of the league's greatest pitchers, holding several all-time records, including 163 wins and 1,076 strikeouts.
I heard about her.
Yeah.
I thought, God, she's got to be a very good pitcher. But I didn't see her pitch too many times. I really wasn't with the team during the times she was pitching. I knew about her, though.
Oh, yeah.
She was great.
Helen Sis Waddell, an excellent softball player from Pennsylvania, grew up playing with her 5 brothers, who gave her the nickname Sis. She was an all-star basketball player in high school, but she was scouted by the South Bend Blue Sox and invited to try out for the league, which she had never even heard of at that point. She played second base for the Rockford Peaches in 50 and 51, helping them to the championship in her first year. What do you remember about Sis Waddell?
I never knew anything about her, really, until I came home after I was all done playing, and I decided to be an artist.
Yeah.
Knowing her now as a friend, I had to laugh because she was going to introduce me to Snooky Harold. And I said, she's the only person I know on this team that I really like. But that was during our reunion.
Yeah. Rose Gayshock is the connection between the Bloomer Girls of the 1930s, which you mentioned previously, and the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. She pitched for 7 years before joining the South Bend Blue Sox in 1944. She came to the Peaches in 45, where she would play until the league folded, besides a brief stint with the Grand Rapids Chicks for a part of the 1950 season. Rose played every position throughout her career besides shortstop and catcher. She was a good hitter with power, and she was an excellent bunter, but she was really known for her pitching. She had 94 career wins and was an all-star in each of the final 4 seasons of the league. And on August 26, 1953, she pitched a no-hitter. You were in the league at that time. Was it big news when pitchers would throw no-hitters?
Yeah, it was big news. But a lot of people didn't like Rosie.
Why not?
She was just a sentimental person. She was always to herself. And she was grouchy all the time. So I never had too much to say one way or the other about her.
A lot of people know that the teams had chaperones. Yours was a woman named Dottie Green. And she wasn't an average chaperone. Chaperones were usually older women. They handled the players' paychecks and housing, made sure that they followed the league's strict rules for proper behavior, and mentored some of the young players, because most players in the league were between the ages of 17 and 22, and many of them were away from home for the first time, so having an older woman around to almost be a maternal figure made sense. But Dottie Green was a former player. She was a catcher for 4 seasons with the Rockford Peaches, but her career ended in 1947 when she tore ligaments in her knee. After her time in the league, she became a captain of the guards at the state prison in Framingham, and she said, quote, "I never would have been able to handle that without the training I got on the ball field." What do you remember about Dottie Green?
Well, I knew Dottie only distantly. I only was the rookie at the time. Not even a rookie. I was just practicing with the team.
But she would be around for practices, right?
Yeah, she would be there. But she really was very quiet in her job. She never bawled anybody out or whatever.
Do you think that's because she had been a player, so she knew how she wanted the chaperone to treat her as a player?
Could be, very much so.
What were some of the rules that players had to adhere to on the field so as not to break the code of conduct? as set by the league.
We were just supposed to be there on time to...
Were you allowed to spit on the field or curse, or were those things prohibited?
No, never did. Never did. But I never heard of any rules that we were not supposed to do that.
Did you guys have to wear makeup on the field? Like, did you have to wear lipstick, or was that only off the field?
Oh, yeah. I always wore that.
What about off the field? What were some of the rules you had to adhere to off the field? And was there a certain dress code that you had to...
Only the one that I just mentioned was the slacks. I never had any. And as far as dress codes, we never really had too many things to say about that.
But you guys had curfew and...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about that kind of stuff.
You know, I never heard and saw a chaperone ever pick anybody on that type of thing. They were always kind of nonchalant about it, you know.
Yeah.
They weren't going to tell anybody about any player that they may push down to a level that they didn't want them to go.
Interesting. If players did get caught breaking the rules, there were fines of $5 for the first offense, $10 for the second offense, and suspension for the third offense. Those were automatically imposed for breaking any of the league's rules as outlined by the Code of Conduct. Most players followed the rules rather than risk being thrown out of the league, but what were some of the ways that players would break the rules when they did, and how would they avoid being caught? Or do you think they always got caught, but the chaperones were just not caring?
Well, I know that I heard some of the players leaving the city. They'd go to other cities after the game. I'd say, how in the heck can they do that? And they'd come back early in the morning, and they'd get ready to play ball. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. The league held a charm school for players during its first 2 years to help the women learn to behave like proper ladies. But how did players navigate self-expression, especially when it came to clothing? Like having a uniform that was a skirt and not being able to wear pants must have felt really limiting, or was that normal because that's just what people wore back then anyways?
It was something I never knew any other way to dress or to wear my clothes. So it was fine with me. And I never wore a pair of slacks until I was in my late 20s, and I was done playing baseball. So you weren't allowed to wear slacks when you were a ball player.
Yeah. In many newspaper articles, Carl Glanz, the team's business manager, was mentioned or quoted. Was his role more like a mixture between general manager, marketing and public relations, and traveling secretary? Like, what did business manager mean?
I wouldn't know because I was, at the time, ignorant of anything beyond playing ball.
Sometimes a player from the previous year's roster wouldn't show up for spring training the following season, whether it was because she had a child in the off-season or had obligations with another job or her family, or if she just couldn't decide in time if she wanted to play another year. The team she was expected to play for would essentially release her into a pool of similar players, and then the other teams would have an opportunity to sign them if they wanted to. But rosters weren't always set in stone, regardless of when players may or may not show up for spring training. Do you know anything about the allocation board and what their purpose was?
I don't believe I ever got to know anything on that.
From year to year, how much turnover was there on a given roster? Were the rosters pretty set, or was it basically like starting from scratch?
Every year, the roster would change because of the rookie rule. And they had to play 49 games. And if you did not play 49 games, you had to stay on the team. Because they could then play you. They had to have two players all the time. And so if you got to play under the 49 games, you'd either get traded or you'd stay on the team. And as it was, I would have been traded if I had stayed with the team.
Right. So the Peaches dynasty ended in 1952, but 1952 was also a hard year for you personally. You mentioned your mother passed away and you were in Chicago to pursue a career as a technical artist. You were only 22 years old at the time. Did you think that baseball was behind you?
Yeah, I did, until I got on the bus. And it was shocking to get on a bus and then meet the guy that used to train in Chicago that I went to school.
Mitch Scupian? Is that?
Yes.
So in 1953, you signed with the Kalamazoo Lassies after their manager, Mitch Scoopy, watched you play softball in Oak Park. Even though you had tons of experience playing and practicing with the Peaches dating all the way back to 1945, you were still considered a rookie, like we talked about, because you hadn't accumulated enough service time during your 1949 stint actually on the Peaches roster. Mm-hmm. So you played second base, shortstop, and right field, and then wore number 12 for Kalamazoo that year. That's the year that you got your nickname, Little Bonnie. Why were you called that?
People ask me all the time in the fan letters. Bonnie Baker was the catcher on the South Bend Blue Sox, mm-hmm. and she was a fantastic player. And the one reporter, I guess he's the announcer, said, hey, there's a girl that's on the Kalamazoo Lassies at the time. She looks like Bonnie Baker, so we're going to call her Little Bonnie. And that's what happened.
Yeah, and it stuck.
Yep.
Did that bother you?
No, it didn't bother me because she was a fantastic ball player. And she became the manager of the team.
Right.
So she had to be good.
What was it like traveling from city to city? Did you guys have a team bus? Did you take the train?
Bus. All the time, buses. And it was awful because we were just so tired when we got on the bus.
Did the buses
sometimes we'd have a double header.
Yeah.
And then travel that night to another city.
And the buses didn't have air conditioning, right?
No.
So you're just sitting in this hot bus in dusty uniforms.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was us.
And I know how often the games were being played, but would you play a series with the team? Like, would you be in one city for 3 or 4 games in a row and then go to the next city? Or was it literally one game here, one game there, one game here, one game there?
I remember it to be series because it would be either 2 games or 3 games, mm-hmm. but never 4. Mm-hmm. We were never on that kind of a situation.
And when you were in your home city, you would stay with a host family, right?
Not me.
But the average player generally...
Oh, the Peaches in most cases stayed with families.
In Rockford, but what happens when you were on the road? Would you guys stay in hotels?
Yes. I remember staying in a hotel when I was with Kalamazoo, mm-hmm. and we were staying at the Faust Hotel. And those rooms were so little, and they'd have big fans on the ceiling. So I said, I think I'm going to play a trick on some of these girls. So I grabbed a bunch of jelly beans, and I threw them up in the air and hit that fan, and they whirled all over the place. Everybody was ducking all over the place. I had so much fun that day, but it's the only thing I really remember.
Mm-hmm. What were the hotels like? Were they nice?
I'd say, yeah, they were, other than the Foss Hotel, I thought were nice.
Yeah.
You know, they were a little larger than that. Mm-hmm. But I didn't have any problems with that.
Did you guys ever have to sleep on the bus?
No, never remember doing that.
Mm-hmm. Where would you guys eat?
Well, when I was in Kalamazoo, I would have donuts that were right across the street from the house we stayed at mm-hmm. for breakfast.
Would the teams feed you at the stadium? Were you able to eat for free from the concession stands at the stadium?
No, they gave us an allowance for the day.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever we could find at that price was what we ate.
Yeah. And then whatever you didn't spend, you got to pocket.
Yeah.
Yeah. So was that a strategy for some players that...
No, it was too little to even be able to have any leftovers.
Yeah. What kept you all entertained during the long bus rides and all of your downtime? Because you guys were together every day. Like,
I liked that, though. I wanted to have the feeling of knowing what I was doing the next day. And it was nice to know that, hey, I'm going to play a game that night, or maybe I'm not. I'm going to sit on the bench. Mm-hmm. But I liked the idea of just knowing that I was on this team and I was going to play. But we had a lot of time going to the beaches. Cool. We went to the beaches almost every day we were in Michigan. We had a lot of fun there.
And when you guys were on the bus, would you guys play poker? Would you sing songs? What would you
sing.
do? Uh-huh.
We would sing constantly. And I can't even remember half of the music that we did sing, but we were always singing.
Well, they sang that song in the movie.
The Players song?
Yeah, it was a real song called Victory Song.
That was only made up for the movie, I think.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So
Yeah.
you don't remember singing that during your career ever?
No.
Okay. So it was written for the movie specifically?
I think it was, because I don't ever remember hearing that song any other time.
Interesting.
And we did a lot of singing,
Yeah.
believe me.
Kalamazoo went 56-50 during the 1953 regular season and made it to the playoffs, where you beat the Fort Wayne Daisies in the first round of the playoffs. Unfortunately, Kalamazoo lost to the Grand Rapids Chicks in the championship. What was that experience like, playing your first full season and making it all the way to the championship?
Well, all I can remember was the last game we were playing, and it was so cold that day. We had to get under the benches because we were so cold. We had a fan blowing at us that had some heat, but it was unreal. And then sometimes it would snow a little bit.
Wow. Yeah.
So
Well,
it was something that we just didn't experience that much.
that late in the year in Kalamazoo, Michigan, like, yeah, sometimes it might snow.
It was just a few flakes.
So on days like that, when it was cold out, teams issued long sleeve shirts to wear under the uniforms that were dark colors. Is that what you remember about the
I
uniforms?
don't remember any shirt that I got
Yeah, okay.
from the league, frankly.
And what about the stadiums and the condition of the fields themselves?
They were in good shape.
Yeah,
They were. A
interesting.
friend of mine, she turned around and married one of the groundskeepers. So they were pretty good.
Nice. Let's talk about some of your teammates on the Kalamazoo Lassies, who lost in the championship in 1953, but then went on to win the championship in 1954.
Dottie Schroeder.
Yeah, let's talk about Dottie Schroeder first. Dottie is the only player to have played all 12 seasons in the league, starting in
Right.
1943 for the South Bend Blue Sox at the age of 14. She was a shortstop her entire career, and her smoothness and grace in fielding ground balls was overshadowed only by her powerful throwing arm. In fact, Cubs manager Charlie Grimm described Dottie as a $50,000 player if she had been a boy. When the league folded after the 1954 season, Dottie became a regular on Bill Allington's touring team of 11 All-Americans. And when a lack of finances caused the tour to end after 4 summers, she'd played a record of 15 seasons of professional baseball. What do you remember about her? Why was she the first one who came to mind for you?
Because she was the best player, and it was a position I always wanted to play.
Yeah.
But I knew I couldn't play there because this girl was terrific.
Yeah.
She was something else. I remember one game that I was playing, and I was at shortstop, and she threw the ball so high, somebody was sliding into second base. I had to jump so high to try and catch it, and I came down straight down on the bag, and I beat the runner, so we got it out.
Mm-hmm.
She came over and she hugged me, and she said, "Good going, girl."
Yeah.
And she was a big girl, and she had a twin brother,
Right. Don?
which I met when we were having one of our reunions. And I always got a card from her at Christmas time. She was a good person.
Yeah.
She was just a nice player. She was a great gal.
Yeah, great. What about Doris Sams? Doris was an outfielder and pitcher from 1946 to 1953, all with the Muskegon and Kalamazoo Lassies. She was Player of the Year in 1947 and 1949, won the batting championship in 1949, and was the home run champ in 1952 with 12, which set the single-season record at that time. She has the 6th highest career batting average, but she was also a great fielder. In 1947, she tied Rose Gayshock's record of 31 outfield assists in a single season. And on August 18th of that year, she pitched a perfect game against Fort Wayne in front of 6,000 fans. She was a 5-time All-Star and the only player in league history to have been named an All-Star at 2 different positions. A lot of people don't know many of the individual names of players who played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, but she's a name that a lot of people do know. Why has her name lasted all these years?
I only knew her the 1 year, of course, and she was a good person. She really was a nice person, but I didn't know anything about her career. it's like you don't know what's going on around you.
Mm-hmm.
And yet she was always there.
Well, that's interesting that you guys weren't keeping track of your statistics or looking in the newspapers every day of who went 3 for 4 this day. You were just part of the team. You know, you were together every day. They were your family.
We didn't know we were going to be famous one day.
Right.
Or I would have kept everything I had. But I enjoyed the fact that I'd rather play ball than to eat.
Yeah.
And that's the way I felt about it.
At the end of a season, would you have to give your uniform back to the team, or did you get to keep it?
No, I had to give it back. Especially in 53, 54, they did quit.
Right.
And I wish I had played because I would have kept my uniform then. And I know Dottie Key kept it because her son still won't sell it.
Another player that you were teammates with in Kalamazoo was Isabel Lefty Alvarez. You had a couple Cuban teammates during your career, but Lefty Alvarez was probably the best one. She was a pitcher and outfielder. What made her so great?
Her dancing. She could dance up a storm.
Yeah.
And she was my roommate.
Right.
I would laugh because everybody thought I was the Cuban and she was the Italian. I said, no. But she was a good pitcher.
Yeah.
She was.
She was a pitcher and an outfielder in the league from 1949 through 1954. And it's interesting to me that Cubans were allowed to play in the league, but not Black Americans, especially considering that Jackie Robinson had already broken the Major League Baseball color barrier in 1947. Do you recall hearing people in the league talk about letting a black woman break the color barrier for your league, or if anybody felt any pressure to do so?
No. I never heard a thing about black people.
Interesting.
And it wouldn't have bothered me one way or the other. I had a roommate early in age that was a black person, and I liked her.
Yeah.
She was a very good person.
And what about discussions about the player's sexuality? How often was that something that was a topic of conversation?
I don't recall anybody ever saying anything about that. Mm-hmm. I know some of the girls were probably gay.
Yeah.
Especially when I went to play with the Bloomer girls. I felt under the circumstances, that was a little threatening at times because of the way people thought about them.
Yeah.
It didn't bother me one way or the other.
Yeah. The last girl I want to talk about from the Kalamazoo Lassies was June Peppas. She was a first baseman and pitcher from 1948 to 1954. She was a 2-time All-Star and led her club to the 1954 league title. She batted .450 and pitched her way to 2 victories in the 5-game series that year, including an 8-5 victory in the league's last ever game, a game in which she also slammed out 3 hits in 5 trips to the plate and batted in 4 runs. But without her work after her career, the story of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League may have been lost to the sands of time. In 1980, June and a few of her friends began assembling a list of names and addresses of former players. Her work turned into a newsletter and resulted in the league's first ever reunion in Chicago in 1982. Stemming from that reunion, a Players Association was formed in 1987, and if it weren't for that renewed interest, Penny Marshall wouldn't have heard about the league and the movie never would have been made. The reunions became annual events in 1998 with the 80th anniversary reunion held in Kenosha in 2023. Let's first talk about June as a player. What do you remember about her?
June was a very good player. She was always talking to you. She would never avoid you in any way. So I liked her as a player and as a friend, really.
And then after the league ended and you guys went your separate ways for decades, how did it come about that she pulled everyone back together? How did she track everyone down?
Reunions.
But how did she track everyone down to even have their addresses and contact information?
I don't know how she tracked anyone down, but I know that I went to the first reunion in Chicago.
What was that like to see everybody again for the first time in years?
It was fantastic because I saw players I had never known before, and they talked to you. And I said, oh gosh, why didn't I talk to them earlier? I could have learned so much more about baseball.
Yeah.
But they were great gals, and they would have scenes from some of the videos that they had.
The home movies?
Yeah, they would show some of that at some of our reunions.
So was that the first time that you had ever seen video footage of those games?
Right, I did.
Yeah.
And that was kind of surprising because I recognized some of the players that I never knew, but there they were, sitting next to you.
I bet that was surreal.
Yes, it was.
So you were supposed to be traded to the Fort Wayne Daisies in 1954, but due to severe allergy problems, you decided to retire instead. You're only 24 years old. Did you really think that your professional baseball career was over, or was the writing on the wall that the league itself was coming to an end and you just decided it wouldn't have been worth making the effort to come back?
I really didn't know that the league was ending in 54. I knew that I was done playing. I couldn't play anymore because of the allergies that I had. I was getting asthma from it, and I didn't want to have that get to be the point of no return, really. So I made the right decision.
Yeah. The same way in which integration was what eventually led to the demise of the Negro Leagues, the end of World War II led to the demise of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. It wasn't immediate in either case, but those were the turning points. So while both things were good for society as a whole, it also left women and people of color with less options. But unlike the Negro Leagues, where many teams were owned by black owners, most teams in the All-American Girls League were actually locally owned as not-for-profit organizations. Boards made up of leading citizens managed the teams, and any profits for the season were to be used to help pay for local community projects. Most seasons, the Peaches spent more than they earned, so they relied on donations to make up the difference. With that being the case, the Peaches management frequently reminded local fans that attendance at home games spelled financial success for the team. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League folded after the 1954 season. Television had become much more common in American households, and people were deciding to stay home rather than go to ball games. By 1954, the almighty Rockford Peaches sometimes were playing home games in front of less than 100 fans. What were some of the ways you remember teams trying to draw fans to the stadium? Were there any strange promotions or anything like that?
No, they didn't know how to promote the team. There was nothing that I knew of when I was playing that would say to me, this is how you would promote a team. It was something that I never knew, really.
Were any of the games ever broadcast on radio or TV?
No, nothing. There wasn't even an interview of some sort, like the big-time players should have had.
Right.
They didn't get anything like that.
Yeah.
And it was like, you're not talented enough for us to notice what you're doing.
Is that how it felt?
Yeah. And that's how I felt half the time, because I quit and I said, gee, I never got to play too many games and show my talent.
Yeah.
And they did say that I played well from South Bend, Little Bonnie. Other than that, I didn't have anything to go by.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Bill Allington. Allington served as the manager of the Rockford Peaches in 1945 and 46, and then again from 48 through 52. He then took the helm as the manager of the Fort Wayne Daisies for the league's final 2 seasons in 53 and 54. Managers were usually men who had played professional baseball, but Allington was actually a fast-pitch softball coach in California when he became aware of the league. Many of his California state championship players came east with him when he accepted a managerial position in the league. He expected maximum effort from his players, but he also required that they intimately know the rules of the game. It wasn't unusual for Bill to give his players pop quizzes about the game during bus rides to away games. Do you remember being around for any of those quizzes? Would he do that during practice too, or just on the bus rides?
Well, he was kind of a quiet man. I remember the one day I was out playing with the Peaches, shagging balls and pitching to somebody. He says, you want to meet Jimmy Fox? I said, who's he? I didn't know who he was.
Right. Yeah.
I had no idea. I never saw a major league team. I thought, I'll meet him.
Yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah. And that was it, really. I just felt under the circumstances. I said, you dumbbell. Afterwards, I said, here he is, Jimmy Fox, the great hitter. I just was unknowingly dumb about those things.
Yeah, that just wasn't the world that you were a part of.
I didn't follow any major league team.
Yeah.
After I quit playing baseball, I turned around and I said, I'm going to take a team out of Chicago. I said, I got to. I have to live baseball yet. Mm-hmm. And so I picked the White Sox in '54. And I've been a fan since then. But right now, I'm just mad at them because there's nothing there to show what their talent is.
Well, at least when you first made your decision, you were rooting for a really fun team. 5 years later, they go to the World Series, the Go-Go White Sox. You've got Fox and Aparicio, and they were a fun team in the 50s. So definitely a better decision than having become a Cubs fan at that time.
Well, when they won the World Series in '05, I cried because they were winning.
Yeah.
I just was so happy.
You'd been a fan for 51 years and never saw him do it before.
No.
Yeah.
And it was just something that was so great. Now my niece knows what it's like because she's following the Cardinals, and they're having the same problem as the Sox are. Losing their players.
Bill Allington organized Allington's All-Stars, made up of some of the best players from the league. They toured and played exhibition games against men's teams coast to coast from 1955 through 1958 after the league folded. They even traveled north into Canada and south into Mexico. Do you have any idea how the players were chosen who participated on that team, or do you remember hearing anything about it?
I didn't know anything about it. I had no idea that they had continued to play, really.
Yeah. For the players whose baseball careers were over when the league folded, many of them went on to careers in law, medicine, or teaching. Do you think that playing in the league gave players the courage to go on to professional careers at a time when women didn't really do things like that?
I do, because it gave them the backbone to do it. And I really was battling for a job in men's positions. I was trying to be an artist. I was trying to be a technical artist. All the men were doing that.
Yeah.
There were no women doing it, but I enjoyed breaking the ice.
Yeah, good for you. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League lasted 9 seasons, but it was nearly completely forgotten until the release of the movie A League of Their Own with Tom Hanks, Gina Davis, and Madonna in 1992. Did it feel like a fever dream to you that there was this thing that you did that was so important to your life and so important for the country during the war, but after a certain amount of time, you would tell people about it and they would have no idea what you were talking about or that anything like that had ever happened before? What did that feel like?
It felt awful because I never really wanted to talk about baseball because I thought it was something that was gone and dropped. And then when the movie was introduced as something they wanted to do, I thought, God, we're going to do that all over again. And I just felt part of it then. And it was strange because everybody would say, I didn't know you played ball. I did too. And I said, what kind of ball were you playing? Oh, I was with the machine so-and-so. And I said, that's not the professional ball I was playing in.
Yeah.
And it was something you had to tell people about.
Right.
I felt bad about that.
Did you ever wonder, what it was all for?
We're famous.
Now you are, but I mean before the movie came out. So for 45 years, nobody had any idea what you were talking about.
Now, I know, but I'd never really talked about it. I never said anything to anyone about I was one of the members of the league. We did get to have reunions, so we were in touch with one another, but nobody else knew about it.
You actually appeared in the final scene of the movie A League of Their Own, when the former members of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League were all playing on Doubleday Field in Cooperstown, New York. But it wasn't just a given that since you were a former player that you'd automatically get to participate. You had to try out for that. What was that process like?
The practice was in Skokie. I think that's Chicago.
Yeah, it's just outside of Chicago. Yeah.
Okay. And I had to be there 4 days. Well, I went and I thought, what are we going to be doing all 4 days? But then comes Madonna, and then comes all the other girls. And I'm so excited I can't even breathe. I even got a ball, and I had them all sign it.
Cool.
Stupid me leaned on somebody else's thoughts and said, spray the ball and it'll preserve it. Well, spraying the ball made it blur. Mm-hmm. So I lost all the names on that ball.
Dang.
I was so mad at myself. I said, don't listen to anybody else now.
Yeah. Do you remember how many girls tried out?
For the movie?
Yeah.
Oh, we were many, but they were going to take all of us.
Right.
So we all went to Cooperstown.
Mm-hmm.
God, we had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I said, now I know why these movie stars get paid so much. Uh-huh. But I enjoyed it. I think I enjoyed that as much as being in the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Just the preparation of it.
The entire All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, not any one individual person or player. Was that kind of the way the league was promoted while it was in existence? Like, not necessarily come out and see Doris Sam of the Muskegon Lassies or Gene Fout and the South Bend Blue Sox, but more like, hey, you guys miss professional baseball, right? Well, here's a way you can still kind of see it. It's girls. Was that kind of how it felt? That, like, they weren't trying to promote people? It was just, here's baseball.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were doing. We wanted to promote the game so that children from here on out would learn how to play baseball. Mm-hmm. And we were part of it. We were the teachers.
How important do you think representation is for young girls? Having things like the movie and the TV show and just being able to easily watch women's sports on TV nowadays, whether it be WNBA games or women's soccer or college sports or the Olympics, how important do you think representation is for young girls?
I feel that they deserve it, but they have to work hard for it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's improving, but I think they need to do more.
What do you think is the most important thing that sports can teach young girls and women?
Togetherness. To prevent yourself from being lonely all the time. To allow yourself to think ahead. Because I always think defensively. Even though I played ball, I say I could use this in my everyday life. When I'm driving even, you drive and you say, where am I going to go if that car is coming at you? I think about those things.
Yeah, interesting. Of course, it was a net positive for the league to be recognized at all, and we wouldn't have had movies or TV series like A League of Their Own without it. But do you think that honoring the league as a whole does a disservice to the individual players whose names that we should know?
No, I don't think so. I think we're one group of women that played, and as they say, if you played 1 minute, you're a member of the All-American Girls.
Yeah.
And that's the way I feel now. I was sorry that I didn't write down I'm a Peach as well as a Kalamazoo Lassie. And they leave me out for that reason. But I'm to blame for that, and I accept it, really.
But you've got the pictures to prove it, though. I mean,
I know. I can have everything to prove that I was a Peach.
Yeah, for years.
Yes. I played with them more than any of the other girls did that were rookies.
Right.
Really.
Yeah.
But I just didn't want to expound on that.
Yeah, I get it. Let's talk about a couple more individual players from throughout the league. Not necessarily people you were teammates with, but just some of the big names in league history. So we mentioned Gene Fout. Gene played from 1946 to 1953 for the South Bend Blue Sox. She led the Blue Sox to championships in 1951 and 52 and was a 4-time All-Star with South Bend. She was named the league's batting champion in 1949 and pitching champion in 1950, 52, and 53. She's the league's all-time leader in ERA with a 1.23 career mark and second in career wins with 140. She was a 3-time 20-game winner and also threw 2 no-hitters and 2 of the 5 perfect games in league history. She won 2 out of the 10 Player of the Year awards given in the history of the league and is just one of 2 two-time winners of that award. Do you remember facing her when you were playing?
No, I never saw her play. And I was sorry I didn't, really. She was a person that you want to be near and know. But I really didn't know anything about her at the time.
When you guys would be on long bus rides or things like that, would you talk about the other teams and the other players in the league, or were you guys just all doing your own thing, kind of just singing and having a good time as a family on the bus?
I think we were just singing and having a good time,
Yeah.
really. I don't recall ever talking about another team. I never talked about any of the other players.
Mm-hmm.
I just enjoyed what I was doing.
So there were no scouting reports or anything like that?
None.
Before a game, your manager wouldn't be like, hey, she throws a really great curveball, so watch out for that? It was all just...
It's not like you see the men preparing for a game. They have so many things now, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
But at the time we played, there was nothing to mention. You were out on your own. You were going to be the one that's facing that pitcher.
So it was all just natural ability.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Let's also talk about Connie Wisniewski. She played from 1944 to 1952 and was a two-way star, playing in the outfield and pitching. Connie's 23-10 record in 1944 helped the Milwaukee Chicks win the championship. The team moved to Grand Rapids in 1945, where Connie played the remainder of her career. In 1945, Connie was the Player of the Year, and she was 32-11 on the mound. She led the league's pitchers in won-loss percentage, a feat which she duplicated for 3 consecutive years, set an all-time low ERA mark with .81 for the season. She led the league in most games pitched, most games won, highest percentage of games won, and lowest ERA. In 1946, the next year, she pitched 40 complete games without once being removed from a game. Although her ERA increased that year to, it's just awful, 0.96, her winning percentage also increased, and she was named the league's pitching champion for the 2nd consecutive year. Do you have any memories about Connie?
I saw her play, but I didn't know anything about her.
Yeah.
And I didn't know her record.
Of course, yeah.
That's something you wouldn't know. But, you know, you envy everybody that's better than you are.
Yeah.
Especially those pitchers.
Yeah. Another woman was Joanne "Jo" Weaver, who played for the Fort Wayne Daisies from 1950 to 54. She was named the league's batting champion in 1952, 53, and 54, and she was named Player of the Year in 1954 with a batting average of .429. She hit 29 home runs, had 87 runs batted in, 109 runs, and a slugging percentage of .763. You were an allergy away from being her teammate in 1954.
Yeah, I was.
Do you remember hearing anything about her?
I knew she was a good player. I knew that she did all kinds of things, but I never knew her at all.
Yeah. All right, 2 more ladies I'd like to talk about. Faye Dancer. She played from 1944 to 1950 as an outfielder and a pitcher. Labeled as a fly-catching genius by sports writers of the day, Dancer could, quote, go back on the dead run, catch the ball over her shoulder, wheel around, and in one motion throw a strike to the catcher in the air from deep center field. Dancer was also known for her hitting and base stealing. In 1948, she stole 108 bases. Quote, she was that rare breed of a ball player who could get up to bat, lay down a perfect bunt, then steal second base. And then the next time up, she could hit the long ball and knock it out of the ballpark. She led the league in both categories at times in stolen bases and home runs. Was that common that players were so good at multiple different aspects of the game?
I suppose she was one of the best at what she did. And I don't believe that there's many players that could do that.
Yeah.
But she was also known as the wild one.
Is that so?
Yeah, that was the story. She was out all the time. But that's all I heard.
Who else in the league kind of had a reputation like that? Anybody?
No, I think she was.
Are you protecting your friends here?
No, no. I don't really know how many people were one way or the other. I just enjoyed the game.
Madonna's character in the movie was All the Way May. Who was she based off of? Anybody? Was there a particular person, or was that just a character?
I don't know what they had in mind, because a lot of this was put together in California.
Right.
But I would say that she was closer to Faye Dancer than anybody.
Interesting.
Because she was kind of the wild one in the movie, and she had a good part. And she really loved baseball.
Yeah.
She enjoyed it, especially when I saw her.
Right. And then the last player I want to talk about is Sophie Curries, who played from 1943 to 1952, mostly as a second baseman for the Racine Bells. In 1946, Sophie was the player of the year. She hit .286. She stole 201 bases out of 203 attempts. She scored 119 runs, walked 93 times, and had a fielding percentage of .973 at second base. She led all players in the playoffs in hitting, stolen bases, and runs scored. Sophie was the real deal and was an all-star year in and year out. She was without question one of the greatest team players developed in the league. What do you remember about Sophie?
Not a thing. I know that actually she was a good player. And I heard that from some of the other players. But I never saw her play. And if I did, I wouldn't remember her. Because this is the way it was at the time.
Yeah.
You just played your own game, and you didn't pay any attention to other players.
Right. And let's also not forget that some of these seasons we're talking about were 80 years ago. So I don't blame you if you don't remember every detail of every game.
I don't remember a lot of it, but I do remember a lot of it.
Of course.
Because I've lived every day.
Yeah.
I think about it.
Yeah.
I think about all the time we had and the chances we had to play.
Yeah.
And what it's done for the women, the young girls. They're getting involved in it now.
Absolutely.
That's what we wanted.
What did you have to give up in your own personal life to be a part of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League? Were there any sacrifices you had to make, either personally or professionally, to participate?
I think I lost my family because I was gone all the time. My family didn't see me play at all. I wanted my mom to see me, but she passed away. I feel that that's the one thing I did lose.
Do you have any regrets about your life or career? Or if you could go back and change anything, would you change something?
I guess I would like to stay with the Peaches. I would have liked to have finished my career with them. But it was disappointing when I broke my foot. And it seems like every time I'm into a game or some kind of a sport, I always hurt myself at the last minute. And you never seem to shine anymore.
Yeah.
You're not a winner. I'm going to search for it. I still have to be a winner.
You had a chance to go see the exhibit in the Baseball Hall of Fame when it first opened. What kind of emotions do you remember feeling as you walked through the museum? What was it like to see your name on the wall? Did you feel like a winner then?
Oh, yeah. You feel like you can't say anything to anybody because they wouldn't understand anyway. And I know that I'm there. I know what I did, and I'm happy about it. Here, I feel that they recognize me more than anybody else did. And I say to myself, these people don't even know me, and they still feel that I'm a Peach. So I'm going to let them believe that.
But you were one. It's not
I
like
know,
it's not like
I
you're
know.
letting them believe that.
I know.
It's
And
something to be believed.
It's hard for me to accept that type of thing. It's been hard for all these years to think that I really was a Peach, because it's never been shown. I've never been invited to anything. And when I am, I don't feel like I can accept it.
That's a shame, because you were a part of that team.
I agree. I agree with you. It's foolish of me to think that way, but it's just the way I am.
Well, next year, you need to go to the reunion, all right?
I'd like to.
Okay.
But I was afraid to go to the reunion because of this thing. When I got hit with that car, it ended my traveling and my life, really, because I can't do the things I wanted to do. And I could have done them very easily. But that's the way the ball bounces.
Yeah. Well, it's a shame. You definitely had some incredible experiences and were a part of that team. Whether you're publicly recognized or not, you know that you were part of that team. You've got the pictures to prove it. You know, Dave has the
That's
photo
true.
albums. I've looked through them. I know you were a part of that team. So I
Yeah.
hope that you are able to come to
Well,
accept
I
that.
think most of the people in Rockford they're at a point where they didn't know what happened anytime. So you could tell them any kind of story. I could tell them that I was a peach for 10 years. So you don't know.
Yeah. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? Anything you want to touch on?
I think you've covered pretty much everything.
Cool.
I see nothing to add to it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. This was a real honor to sit down with you and talk about some of these players who I think deserve more recognition than they've been getting.
Well, they should. And it's a shame that I didn't see more of them or talk to them because a lot of them played shortly before I was a professional.
Right.
Or after I was a professional.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much. I hope this was as fun for you as it was for me.
It was.
Great. Thanks, Ange. All right, now it's time for a segment called What Do You Think, Mom? Where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
So last year for Mother's Day, we were lucky enough to spend the day together. And so what did we do? We drove to Rockford to go to Bayer Stadium and go see the actual place where the Rockford Peaches played, because we're both firm believers in being in the space where it happened. And it was great to be around the field. They had a lot of informative boards and plaques and monument things going on there. Could get a real good feel for the history of that field, which has been renovated now. And then we went on to Midway Village, to the museum there, where they had artifacts and exhibits so that we could do an even deeper dive into what the Rockford Peaches were all about beyond the movie. And I think we both walked away thinking we just had a great day.
Yeah.
Because that's who we are.
I was shocked that we had never gone there before.
Yeah, never even thought about that it was going on. And I had seen spring of 2023. There was a lot of coverage about how they were going to be doing different events there and play different games. And, you know, Rockford is a city that has been up and down in its economic life. And it was great to see that some funds were dedicated to that field because it is a historic place, not only for Rockford, but for the whole thing of what we're going to be talking about today.
But forget the fact that now it's becoming more part of the public consciousness. And, you know, you're talking about the U.S. Women's National Baseball Team played an exhibition game there in early August of 2023. You and I living in the Chicagoland area and being the people that we are.
I know.
A League of Their Own is my favorite baseball movie. And I know it's one of yours. It might be your number one. The main team is the Rockford. Like, we know where Rockford is. We have got family who live in Rockford. How had we never made that trip and gone to be like, I wonder where they played, and just figured it out on our own? Like, that's something that we do.
Right.
How had we never done that?
We've gone to just look at dirt where something used to be.
Right,
and
exactly.
And then to find out that basically the structure is still there and it's an active field again and the ticket gate's intact and you get the feel for it. But the point is, how did we not know? Whenever things come up about historic spots in Chicago that I'm not aware of, I feel delinquent, you know, because I live for that kind of thing.
Right.
It was quite the surprise, and it was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah. You mentioned going to Midway Village afterwards. A great basis of this interview was a really cool display that they had at that museum of the different game-used baseballs and softballs used in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Every time there was a change in the ball, they would display the new version and give it statistics of what year it was introduced and what size it was. And then at the end of that display, they had like a spreadsheet essentially with, okay, this is the year, this is how long the base paths were, this is how far the pitching rubber was, this is the size of the baseball. That was really eye-opening to me. I think everyone kind of watches A League of Their Own and thinks that the league played with the same size ball and the same rules as Major League Baseball, but the league really started out as a softball league, even with the fact that the pitching was underhand. It gradually became a baseball league, but that's something that most people don't realize. And I had done research about some of the teams and that league over the past few years and had learned that. But to see that display, it really drove it home that like, oh yeah, this sport changed and it literally became a different sport. Like baseball and softball are not the same sport.
Right. And in a very short period of time, because when you think of MLB, it is controversy, shortening or lengthening the base path or moving the mound. It's a big deal in all
Even
this time.
The height of the mound,
Right.
the distance hasn't moved in a century, but the height of the mound. You know, when in 1968, Bob Gibson had his terrific year, and then like, this guy's
Right.
too dominant. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
I really thought it would have been a much bigger deal to Ange and to the women she played with that seemingly every year or two, the rules they played by and the equipment they used was different. But that really didn't seem like it mattered at all to her. They just rolled with it. And it really comes through in this interview how much Ange just really loved to play the game.
One of the first things I was going to talk about was her most common theme. We just wanted to play.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing else really mattered. You know, you have your focus, and once you have that, everything else, you just deal with it.
Yeah.
But some of the changes, I mean, like adding 2 feet, it was a sizable thing. And
Right. I
if
think
you-
there was one season to another, they moved the pitching rubber back 7 feet. Like
Right.
that's a significant change.
Right, in so many ways. Once the ball is in play on the field, and they just made it work.
Yeah, another thing that I had never really consciously thought of, or maybe the time that I was introduced to baseball and women's baseball through a league of their own, or just being a fan of the sport and watching on TV and collecting baseball cards, blah, 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 blah. I was a child, so I never really grasped how old players were. Mm-hmm. They were all just adults to me. Mm-hmm. And in Ange's interview, she says the average girl started their careers between the ages of 17 and 22.
Yeah.
Like those are children.
Right.
I'm 37. A 17-year-old is a child. You know, like they've been shaving for maybe 3 years. But the fact that she had been playing with the Peaches for 4 years already, and then she broke her foot and was never able to play, and she was still only a senior in high school.
Yeah.
Think of how young she was when she started doing all this. That timeline was very surprising to me, that they were just children,
Right.
but still playing at this high level of baseball and drawing crowds and traveling all over the Midwest. And, you know, like,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons why they had chaperones, is
Oh,
because
definitely.
this is the first time they had ever left their hometown.
Right.
In most cases, you know, this is the first time they'd ever slept in a hotel. You know, that was another thing that Ange brought up during the interview. I never really knew that the players stayed with host families in the city where they played their home games. You know, obviously when you're on the road, you're staying in hotels or things like that. You know, I'd never really considered where they lived. And she said that most players lived with a host family. But I wonder what the logistics were for the teams to find host families willing to house a player for a season. You know, like how did that all work? You know, like that's something that you don't consider when you're like, I'm going to start a baseball league.
But you know what? At that time, which is the 40s, right? So there were a lot of things going on. And a lot of people took boarders in their home. They have nothing to do with the baseball league. It wasn't uncommon because it was an extra source of income.
But I don't think these girls were paying.
No, but the concept was there that you had an extra bed. It didn't even have to be a bedroom. You had an extra bed, and you know, you would have somebody be part of it. It was a much more communal feel to small towns. And even though Rockford was not a small town, Rockford was a very big city because it had a lot of industry. You still had that mentality. It was just the way things went. I thought this was a very important interview, especially as someone who loved A League of Their Own and knows it so well. That told a story, and it brought their story to light after 50 years of it being in the dark. And that was important, too. Of course that was important. We wouldn't even be sitting here today if not for that movie. But why the interview with Ange was important was you're talking to someone who lived through it, and yes, there were touching moments within the movie, but sometimes you can feel like you're watching a movie. Yes, you're sympathetic to it, but it's a much deeper level, and you realize this was her life. And that came through a couple different times. Towards the end of the interview, and you ask her what personal sacrifices did she make in her pursuit of the game, and was she lost her family. And she came from a big family, and families were close because just how you were saying, when these girls make the team and they're traveling, not only is it the first time out of their hometown, but they're not without their families.
Right.
That's why you need the chaperones. But family was everything back then. And so you're completely drawn out. And none of her family generally came to see her play because they're working, which goes to why you needed night games.
Right.
Because you have an industrial city, everyone's working during the day. And blue-collar workers are the ones who are the fans, that neighborhood.
Right.
I think hearing her perspective, even after all these years, she has almost a century under her belt, and that loss of her mom and her parents sound very progressive because she is born in 29, and 2 weeks before she's born, I think, is the crash.
Right.
And so now you're going into the Depression, and she's number 7.
Out of 8.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's intense, her childhood. And yet they're going to send her to art school in Rockford. That is amazing. I was shocked.
Or let her play sports.
Right. She asks her mom, can she go to follow the Bloomer Girls when her heart is broken with her broken foot? And mom says, okay.
Yeah.
I don't think my mother in the 1960s would have let me go off to Chicago, or another big city to go join the Bloomer Girls. I think there'd be more questions than, sure, go ahead. So again, I really think her parents were progressive and even more so why it was important to her to have her mom see her play and see her attain her dreams. Some of the very first stories that Ange told tell us immediately who she is. And the first thing is when she goes to see her first game, and the very next day, she goes back to the field on her own to say, how can I be part of this? What can I do?
Let me shag fly balls. I'll do whatever you need.
Who does that?
Ange.
So that's right.
Yeah.
And I think the young women who got this league going or were playing ball in the first place to even have players to draw from to form a league, they have a different inner drive within them that sets them apart.
Another thing kind of along those lines, when I asked her if she thought about World War II every day, I wasn't sure what her answer was going to be, but somehow I was still surprised that her answer was that she never thought about it. Like, that doesn't seem to me like that would have been the normal response from a teenager in the 1940s. Like, speaking from my own experience, I was in high school. I was about her age when September 11th happened. And we lived in the Chicagoland area and had friends who worked in Chicago and worked in the Sears Tower. And like, you think maybe the Sears Tower is going to be next.
Most definitely. That morning, absolutely.
I don't think the people who lived in Rockford that were my age at that time thought we might be hit with a terrorist attack because they weren't a big city.
Right.
But World War II was different because the war was going on. Like, people were being drafted. And so whether you thought Germany was going to bomb Rockford, Illinois, like, that's not what I was expecting. But you'd think that, like, you've got to know your family members or your neighbors or teachers, like, people in your life are in the war.
That's right.
So
young men.
Yeah.
Not much older than you.
Right.
And there was a major army camp right outside Rockford called Camp Grant. Illinois people went through Camp Grant. It was a huge camp. 3 of my uncles were processed through there. Once they were drafted, that would be where they'd go and got their assignment. So not only do you have outside people coming in, and that's a major force near Rockford, but you also have a communal sense because thousands and thousands of men were being drafted. So you had physical reminders all around your neighborhood. You had banners in the window that showed if you had a son fighting or a son lost, and I'm saying son because that's what it was back then. You had boards on a corner in the neighborhood that at any given time showed all the boys from that neighborhood who were fighting or who were lost. They were just always present in the minds. And it could be that maybe she didn't have family members that were, fighting, but the whole nation was involved in the war effort. Small towns all over, they were all in support. It was, victory gardens and rationing.
Right.
Just everything. All aspects of everyday life had implications deriving from the war.
You just brought up something else about the different cities. When Ange and I were talking about her time playing with the K&K co-eds, Ange said, quote, "We went to all the cities and then listed Kenosha, Chicago, and South Chicago."
Yeah.
Did people think of Chicago and South Chicago as different cities?
Even though there's not a separate city called South Chicago. Just like New York has several sections, Chicago has several sections. But South Chicago was a very big separate section because that's where the steel mills were. My mother's family, that's where they were all from, South Chicago.
But did they
that's where she was born.
Did they consider it a different city, though?
No.
The way that she answered that question, the way she worded it was just interesting to me. We went to Kenosha, we went to Chicago, and we went to South Chicago.
It's not a separate city.
Yeah.
It's still Chicago. But I bet when you addressed an envelope, you wrote South Chicago.
Okay.
Versus you wouldn't write North Chicago. Yeah, so it wasn't a separate city. It was part of it. But it was very much a huge population within there because you had all the steel workers.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, so when she said that, I'm like, oh, right. Been there many times.
Yeah.
When she was talking about the K&K co-eds and she talked about designing their uniforms.
Yes.
When she's 15.
Right.
I couldn't even doodle on my notebook in math when I was 15. And here she is designing a uniform that looked pretty cool.
Yeah.
Very reminiscent of her 2005 world champion White Sox team. So she was the precursor to what their uniforms were, the black and white. I happened to just be holding a Brzezinski jersey a short time ago, so it's on my mind.
AJ, if you're listening, please come on the podcast so my mom stops asking me to ask you to come on the podcast. She's your biggest fan. You are her favorite player of all time, and she hates Michael Barrett.
Yep. Yeah.
Please come on the podcast, AJ.
I would like that, yeah.
Yeah, we'll drive.
I would really like that.
We'll drive to you. We can meet not at your house also, so you don't have to give us your address.
Wait, don't be giving things away already. Let's see how it unfolds.
I've driven you to the ER how many times? I don't need to start bailing you out of jail.
That is the honest to God truth. We'll leave the jail for down the road in the future. When she was talking about not missing a single game during the 1945 season for the Rockford Peaches in one of the years that they won the championship. And she talks about she was so surprised to see the stands full to watch girls play baseball. Mm-hmm. And how mind-blowing that must have been. When you think about it, it was only going on in these select few cities
right.
that Mr. Wrigley put teams into.
And all in the Midwest. I asked the question during the interview, and I worded it in a way, something about how this league was important for the country. Mm-hmm. But when you really think about it, like, I don't think people in California knew that this league existed. And I don't think people in New York knew that this league existed. People in the Midwest maybe did, but not everybody, I'm sure. But Californians had their own league. When I talked to... That's where she started. She started as a softball player in California.
Okay. Did they have a league like that in California? The reason I'm asking that is Wrigley was also based in Catalina Island. Mm-hmm. He has a very strong California connection. So
absolutely. So they had professional softball leagues in California, and a lot of the players from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League were recruited and scouted. Think of the John Lovitz character going out to find Gina Davis.
Right.
They were sending scouts to the West Coast because they knew there were players out there, but they weren't baseball players. They were softball players. Mm-hmm. So I think the players in those leagues may have been aware of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, but I don't think some random person in a coffee shop in San Francisco was reading the newspapers every day looking for the Rockford Peaches score.
Right. Did he only build up a league in the Midwest, or did he do a separate league that was called something else in California?
I don't think that league was his. I think that was separate from anything he was doing. I think he owned the Midwest League. You know, and we talked about the proximity of the teams just now a little bit. In the interview, Ange and I talked about how in 1952, the Peaches played 109 games in 110 days with only 4 days off, and that the longest stretch was games on 43 straight days.
Unbelievable.
Crazy. Even though all those teams were relatively close in terms of mileage, you think that travel from city to city wasn't quite as simple as just simply getting on the highway.
Absolutely not. And I know, again, being a little kid in the early 60s, we had relatives that lived 40 miles away in Kankakee, Illinois. Mm-hmm. And it was a big deal. Like, you planned it to take a drive. We had to get up early in the morning. It was like a 2-hour drive, it seemed. It couldn't have been 2 hours. I know we were talking about how perception is skewed when you're a little kid. But I do know it was a big thing, and there was carpooling because there were no expressways. Halsted Street, for example, was Route 1. Mm-hmm. Those were your quote-unquote expressways. Well, some of them were still 2-lane roads for miles and miles, and I could make that trip today pretty quickly, but then it was much longer. And then you put a bus, and that's how they were traveling. In some of the Indiana towns, there's nothing going on. You don't know what the roads are, and so we can't think of it as those cities are so close together. Some of them are, but
they didn't have the same modern means of transportation.
Exactly right. So from Racine to Kenosha, very close. But Racine to Rockford, to us it's close. Back then it would have been, a little bit more involved, and so they would drive at night or whatever. And when you're talking about the stat that you just gave of 109 games within 111 days, where are they getting good rest? Only when they're in a homestand, but when they're traveling on the road, and I'm thinking they try to keep them on the road and not going back and forth because it's just not an economical proposition.
Well, Ange said that, because I specifically asked her, was it one game in this city, one game in the next city? And she said, no, you're in the city for 2 or 3 games straight. So you're at least staying in a hotel. You might not be getting great rest in a hotel either. but at least you're not sleeping on the bus.
Right, because that's a disaster.
Yeah, like when we talked to Sam Allen, the former Kansas City Monarch
Right.
and Negro League player, he talked about how sometimes they would have to sleep on the bus, and not sleep on the bus while the bus was moving. Like,
Yeah.
we're driving 5 hours overnight and you need to just catch some sleep. But like, they'd get to a town and there wouldn't be a hotel in the
Right.
town that allowed them to sleep there. So now what do you do? Well, you just sleep on the bus. It didn't seem like that same thing was happening to players in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League.
No, because apparently they were lining up bottles in the hallway of the hotels that they happened to score.
Well, not Ange. She wasn't doing
No,
it.
but she happened to see it.
Yeah. When I was asking Ange about specific players, she mentioned Faye Dancer, the girl who stole 108 bases in one season.
Yeah,
Ange said she was, quote, the wild one.
Right.
And, quote, out all the time. And that Madonna's character in the movie was probably based on her. Like, those are the fun stories that you're not going to get without talking to somebody who was there.
that's right. In every generation, there are certain names that are popular, and so they pop up more often.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you say Dottie or some of the other names that you said, I immediately think of the character in the movie, and I'm associating those names with those people rather than the live people that Ange is playing against on a field.
Yeah.
But when you have a name like Faye Dancer, now, come on.
Mm-hmm.
Another player that you mentioned was Dottie Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
One of the stats she had was getting hit by 92 pitches
In one season.
in one season.
Yeah.
And it just made me think, these women are not wusses.
Yeah.
You're still getting hit by a ball that's coming at you at a high velocity
Mm-hmm.
and is maybe going to need more than just dirt rubbed on it 92 times within one season.
Well, think about the slogan was dirt in the skirt for when they'd slide. There are gruesome photos of these women. They had a couple of them in the Rockford Midway Village Museum in
Right.
Rockford. And that's why I asked Ange, did you guys have a training staff? Like, how did you guys physically endure that schedule and that many games
Right.
with a roster of 15 people?
Right.
You
Yeah.
can't play 109 games in 110 days with 6 reserves when probably 4 of them are pitchers. So you've got 2 extra players. And I think that's why so many of the women that we mentioned, like Jean Fout, she was the batting champion 1 year and the pitching champion 3 years.
Yeah.
And Connie Wisniewski and some of the other players that we talked about, they were great pitchers and great hitters because you have to be.
Right.
You got to be on the field all the time because we can't afford to just keep a roster spot for somebody who can only pitch every 5 days.
Right.
That was forced by the size of the rosters.
It was interesting what her perspective was because as you are reeling off some of these stats that are just mind-boggling and ask Ange for some personal insight into what that player was like or what did you think when you played against her or whatever, a lot of times she would say, yeah, she was great or yeah, I loved watching her or, you know, I wanted to play because of her or whatever. But then you had her roommate who was Isabel Lefty Alvarez, a Cuban woman. And what made her so great, Ange? Her dancing.
Yeah. She was a great pitcher and a great outfielder, but a better dancer. Yeah.
But when you're going through what you're going through together, and it's only 15 of you, you know each other on a much deeper level, especially if it's someone on your team and your roommate.
And you're all teenagers.
Yeah.
You know, like this is before the age of analytics. So it's not like they were printing out the stat sheet at the end of the night and then all going back to the hotel room being like, can you believe she threw a changeup 3-2? You know, like you play the game, you go home, and then you have fun and get ready for the game the next day. That was kind of a theme in her answers also when I was asking about specific players is she would talk about what type of person they were.
Right.
Not what type of player they were. Like she knew what type of player they were and the stats tell the story too. But it was a lot of times, oh, she was a good person. I like to go golfing and bowling with her. Because that's what they were wanting to do.
Right.
That's how they wanted to spend time and, you know, be friends with each other in that way.
And if it didn't work out, that was the response as well. She was grumpy. Nobody liked her, or, you know, whatever. So humans are humans, basically, across time.
Yeah. I think one of the things that kind of makes it hard for a lot of the players in this league to have name recognition is the fact that the league itself didn't seem to know how to market. The games were not broadcast on radio or television with any sort of regularity, if they were broadcast at all. And the best players weren't really ever interviewed or given a platform to become known. So how do you expect to draw crowds in a sustained way year over year over year? And add to that, many of the players who were great their names changed halfway through their careers because they got married.
Right.
So it's like, I can't even promote you as your maiden name because now that's not what you're called anymore. You're like,
Right.
just what a difficult proposition to promote these players in this league. And it's a shame because these names should be known.
Absolutely.
And that was kind of my line of questioning of asking Ange, do you think it was a disservice to induct the entire league into the Hall of Fame as opposed to individual players?
Right.
And I think she answered diplomatically, and I believe that that's how she felt.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how I would feel.
But you know what? A, we're in a different time.
Mm-hmm.
And B, for women, we're in a way different time.
Mm-hmm.
Because for a married woman, for example, if any of them got a letter, their name wasn't anywhere on that letter.
Mm-hmm.
It was Mrs. John Jones.
Mm-hmm.
She was an appendage of her husband. It wasn't socially acceptable necessarily to have your name in newsprint. They would say, other than your birth announcement, your wedding announcement, and your obituary.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only time your name should appear in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're already going outside the social norms of the time by putting them on the field in a skirt like that and then sliding and in all the things that we saw portrayed in the movie. But it was a delicate thing of how you handle giving a woman their own fame, and it just might have been a pill too big to swallow.
And I understand that in 1943 to 54, when this league was active, that maybe you can't promote the same way that you would promote today.
Mm-hmm.
But when the league was inducted into the Hall of Fame, it's the late 80s, early 90s. At that point, now you can make, I don't know.
What are you saying you think they should have done? Like just only the key players, the way they do on the male side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you go about creating a set of criteria that can fit enough people. For men, you've got to play 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the entire women's league only lasted 11.
Right.
And so you can't be like, okay, well, you've got to play 7 years. Like, where do you draw the line of who was great and who wasn't, who deserves, like in a league of their own, Dottie goes and leaves after one season, but she was the best player in the league for that season. So does she not get in the Hall of Fame? Like,
right.
No, probably not.
Right.
But
right. So then you have to look at what they did
Mm-hmm.
as a social experiment as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And each of them had the role in that for as long as they were in it.
Mm-hmm. But I think that the Hall of Fame has figured out, and Major League Baseball now in the past few years with integrating the record books to include Negro League players,
Mm-hmm.
I think the Hall of Fame is still kind of a separate issue, and it's tough to decide what parts of the Negro League's statistics count when
Right.
we can't verify how many games they played, or, you know, we can pretty much guess how many home runs there were because those home runs oftentimes were recorded in the newspaper the next day, but not always.
Right.
So there's no way to be like, yeah, this guy played 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all as easy as it seems. But they are trying to figure out a way of like, okay, we are going back and inducting players who played in black leagues and in the Negro leagues before the color line had been broken. I think at this point in history, we can figure out a way to start inducting people like Dottie Kamenchek and Gene
Mm-hmm.
Fout and like the players who were unquestionably the best players in this league to get some name recognition, to be more than just, oh yeah, it was girls played for like a decade. It was kind of cool. There's a way to tell their stories and get their actual names and actual statistics out there so people can appreciate how great these women were, because they were. And,
Right.
you know, this is 80 years ago.
Yeah.
And these girls were unbelievable and selling tickets. And like we talked about with Ange, kind of local celebrities, and the people who had access to go watch them play in real life looked up to them. And like you mentioned, it took all of one game for Ange to be a spectator, to be like, I need to be a part of that.
Right.
And that was kind of something I brought up with her about how much does representation matter. You know, you see girls today going to Iowa women's basketball games and watching
Yes,
Caitlin Clark play.
right.
And you've got tens of thousands of people. Now the entire generation of girls younger coming up watching that, like they can aspire to be that.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's more important to identify and recognize individual people than to just be like, yeah, girls used to be allowed to play baseball too. I think it's kind of dismissive.
I don't know. I think what you just said kind of proves them as a collective going in. That whole group needed to be part to even allow Mia Hamm to follow and, you
Totally.
know, the other team sports for girls and turn it around.
I'm glad that the league is recognized in the Hall of Fame. Like, I don't want anybody to take it the wrong way, that I don't think that that should have happened. I do think it should have. But I think now we can take it a step further and be like, these specific women need plaques.
Okay, I'm up with that.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Not like take out the whole league. I'm saying that's great that that happened, but that was now 30 years ago, 35 years ago
I cannot
almost.
believe it. Yeah.
now it's time to really recognize people in a way that's further.
When you look at the women who came forward and were willing to put their good girl reputations for that time on the line, there's something within them that gives them the drive to be able to do that. And once the league is shut down, they still have that drive within them. And so then they go on to what is next. And some of them go out to California and, find other places to play. But other ones now need to figure out what's next in life. And they're still at the cusp of adulthood. And they come into men's fields because that's what they just did. And what did Ange say? She wants to break the ice, similar to what we would say is break the glass ceiling. And the things that she thinks she can do with just a high school education, which again, that was common. You didn't need to be a college graduate to go into these things, but you did need to be a guy. And, the norm back then was if a girl went to high school and graduated, you generally got married right out of high school and then started a family. That was the path. But for her to get out of high school, be doing this, and then go into something else and come into a company and see a Christmas tree hanging from the ceiling, and where someone else from that generation would have been, oh my gosh, what is going on? Something's not right here. She's like, I need to work over there.
Yeah.
And that just tells you who she is and who she was from the very beginning.
Well, Bill Allington, I think, was an important person. Just so happened to be that he was the Peaches manager and was basically the guy who helped Ange break into the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League and become a part of the team. But he went on to champion girls professional baseball after the league folded in 1954. He coached that traveling baseball team for 4 more years. I kind of feel like David Strathairn's character in A League of Their Own honors Bill Arrington's spirit in a way. He truly believed in women's baseball and believed it was not only good for the women who were participating, but that it was a viable product that could be profitable.
Right.
And they don't ever mention Bill Allington's name in the movie. And, obviously the manager of the Rockford Peaches in the movie is Tom Hanks, who is, Jimmy Dugan, but it's modeled after Jimmy Fox. But Bill Allington's spirit was the character Ira Lowenstein.
Right.
One individual person to talk a little bit more about was June Lefty Peppas, who was a former player and then started the list of contact information for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League alums to stay in touch, which then eventually turned into reunions, which eventually got the attention of Penny Marshall, which then led to the movie. And that's why we're sitting here today even remembering this league.
Exactly.
Ange mentioned that the first reunion was in Chicago, and Ange went to it, and that was the first time she had ever seen video footage of games from that league being played. So that was the 80s, so 40 years later, I guess 30 years after 1954. In 30 years, she hadn't seen somebody wearing those uniforms, and now she's watching it like, oh yeah, I remember that person, I remember that person.
Right.
What a cool feeling that must have been.
Oh, yeah. And to be with kindred spirits, people who walk the walk right along with you. Yeah, so shout out to June for pulling it all together.
Do you think she was in the CIA? Like, how did she literally track down all of these women decades later?
Because you have small towns and you have families who didn't move around a lot, is my guess.
Yeah, maybe. Or it's one of those things where you just need to get in touch with 10 different women, and they are all in touch with 3 different women, and they are all in touch with 3 more. And before you know it, now you've got 400 people who have played in the league over the course of its existence.
Right. But I think you would start with the records from the league of where the addresses were. And that's a starting point to just get you in general areas besides what you're talking about. Ange talked about she went to a certain place and made a friend that she was friends with that woman for 50 years. At 94, for her to be so eloquent and so expressive and have a command of vocabulary where the words just came was astounding.
Yeah. One more thing I want to talk about is one of the filming locations for A League of Their Own was at Bosse Field in Evansville, Indiana. I've been tentatively planning a road trip, and that's on the routing, is to hit that, because I've never been there. Opened in 1915, it's the 3rd oldest ballpark still in regular use in America.
Really?
The only 2 older are Fenway and Wrigley. Since it is so old and looked appropriate for the time when the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was going on, that was one of the film sites that they used. And even though a team in that league never actually played their home games at that field, it is still a historic baseball field in America, and with its ties to that movie, like, it's something that I feel like I should have been to at this point, and I just never have.
Yeah.
Same thing with Bayer that we talked about before. Like,
right.
We got there and it's like, well, how had I never been here? That's how I feel about Bosse. And Perry Barber, who we spoke with previously on this podcast, always comments and likes and supports all the posts on social media. The newsletter, like, couldn't ask for a more vocal
great
supporter. She mentioned that she had been there and that there's a local bar that's still open that is the Suds Bucket.
Oh, yeah.
In the movie.
Oh, right.
So she's like, if you're going to go, make sure you go to that place also.
Yeah, and apparently bring your dancing shoes.
Yeah. So I need to meet a girl named Faye.
I want to find out where the Chicago Academy was that they went for baseball girl training.
I don't know where that was. If they were playing indoors, if they were just training and like learning
skills.
Yeah, or
skill clinics.
If they were outdoors and playing on an actual field somewhere, or they could have just been playing at a local high school field. I'm imagining they weren't using Wrigley Field on the days the Cubs weren't in town.
Right. No.
But theoretically, they could have been because the guy who owned the league was Mr.
True.
Wrigley.
That's true. Again, just something never even heard of.
Yeah.
There is one other person, Dottie Green, who was a chaperone. After the league closes down, she ends up working in a prison, which can be an intense situation.
Mm-hmm.
She does that for years and says she never would have been able to do that without her experience on the field.
Mm-hmm.
The inner strength that was built by what they were doing, the barriers they were breaking, but also the physicality of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you gain self-confidence, and it just builds you up from within, so that when Ange was telling the story about how she just thinks defensively now, she thinks analytically, and so she's anticipating any situation, like what happens, like if she's driving or whatever. That analytic mind that's on the field of how are you going to react? What if the ball is hit to me? What does every coach say? What are you going to do when that ball is hit to you? You carry that through life. And they set the stage for my generation.
Yeah. Well, anyways, fun episode.
Yeah, it was great.
I think this was an important one. It's nice to check these boxes. We've spoken with a former major leaguer. We've spoken with a former Negro leaguer. Now we've spoken with a former All-American girls professional baseball leaguer. Like we've said many times over different episodes of this podcast, the goal is to just preserve the stories. And it's nice to have somebody from this aspect of the game be able to tell us what it was like to be a player back then.
That's right.
So yeah, thanks Ange. Thanks Mom.
Thanks Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, and you'll be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. You can also sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I'll use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I'll also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. Last month, we held a contest where our subscribers had a chance to win a free baseball from William Peebles and Huntington Baseball Company. And in the coming months, we'll be rolling out merchandise for the podcast for the first time ever. So subscribing to the newsletter gets you more than just some bonus content. Look for a new issue to be published on the second Friday and the fourth Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research that you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. If you know current or former baseball players, managers, broadcasters, or journalists who you can help us get in touch with, or if you are one, let's talk. Like we discussed earlier in the episode, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League may have been the first professional women's sports league in America, but it wasn't the only one. Scouts for the Chicago-based league initially sought and recruited talent from the Metropolitan League, an amateur Chicago softball league, as well as from several other leagues all over the country and even into Canada. After seeing many of their players leave for the AAG PBL, the Metropolitan League decided to turn from amateur into a professional league. The result was the creation of the 6-team National Girls Baseball League, which began in 1944, composed entirely of Chicago area teams. The National Girls Baseball League was founded by Emery Perici, the owner of a local roofing company, Charles Bidwell, who was the owner of the Chicago Cardinals football team, and politician Ed Kolsky. Perici had operated the Metropolitan League, but to bring legitimacy and notoriety to the league, big-name retired male athletes were brought on. Football great Red Grange was named the president of the league, while former Major League ball players Woody English and Buck Weaver were hired as managers. Yes, the Buck Weaver who was the third baseman for the Chicago White Sox, who you may know as the Black Sox, who was banned from baseball for his role in the throwing of the 1919 World Series. Despite the name, the National Girls Baseball League still played fast-pitch softball. The teams were concentrated in Chicago and the surrounding cities, including Forest Park and Des Plaines. Over its 11 seasons, the NGBL was much less publicized than the AAG-PBL, but the two leagues definitely paralleled each other. Like the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, the National Girls Baseball League also lasted until 1954, drawing up to 500,000 fans per season. To compete for the best athletes, the NGBL offered higher salaries and an easier road schedule, since all the teams were so close to each other. Although they may have technically played different sports, the two leagues were in direct competition with each other. For a time, the two leagues were involved in a strong rivalry for players before meeting and agreeing to a poaching truce in 1946. Many players and several managers appeared in both leagues at points in their careers, most notably Connie Wisniewski and Dorothy Boots Klupping. As similar as the leagues were in some ways, they were also different in a very significant way. While the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was not integrated, the National Girls Baseball League was. Gwendolyn Wong was a Chinese-American who was a left-handed pitcher for the Bloomer Girls. In her only season, she pitched 6 no-hitters, 10 one-hitters, and had 6 two-hit games, facing only 282 batters in 22 games. And those were her 22 games that year. 6 games with no hits, 10 games with 1, and 6 more with 2. That's 22 games. After winning the league championship with the Bloomer Girls, she retired and went on to the University of California, Berkeley. Nancy Ito was a shortstop for the Bloomer Girls and the first Japanese-American ball player in the league. After her time in the league was over, a future coach asked her to learn catching because that team's regular catcher left to get married. In the next 2 decades, Ito was named a 13-time All-American. An outstanding defensive catcher with a strong throwing arm, Ito made only 10 errors in 1,401 chances over 222 games in the Pacific Coast Women's League from 1967 to 1974 for a fielding percentage of .993. It wasn't even her natural position. Former teammate Carol Spanks called Ito, quote, the best catcher I've ever seen, and in 1982, Ito was elected to the National Softball Hall of Fame. Betty Chapman became the first female African-American professional softball player when she signed as an outfielder for the Music Maids of the National Girls Baseball League in 1951. Chapman had 2 RBI in her debut game July 18, 1951, and scored the game-winning run in the team's game 4 days later. She was given the nickname Miss Minnie Minoso in an article that came out 10 days after her debut when her batting average was still over 500. And despite Chapman's success, over the 4 remaining years of the league, very few other African-American players were signed. One potential reason for this could be the fact that during the 1940s and 50s when girls baseball was in its heyday, there were numerous independent all-African-American women's teams that played around the country. For example, Minnie Forbes, who owned the Detroit Stars of the Negro National League, played for Cook's Brown Dolls team, which was based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan from 1947 to 1949. However, black women playing baseball wasn't something that started in the 1940s. During the second half of the 19th century, a semi-pro team called the Dolly Vardens played around the Philadelphia area. The team was assembled by barber-turned-sports entrepreneur John Lang in the 1880s, with newspaper confirmation of games as early as May of 1883. And where does that name, Dolly Vardens, come from, you might be wondering? Believe it or not, it was taken from a character in the 1841 novel Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. And don't forget, it's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means that more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.